I had always believed that the worst parts of New York City were the streets, the alleyways, and the crime. I grew up here, a child of the city, its sounds and chaos ingrained in my bones. But nothing had prepared me for what lay beneath those streets. For most, the subway is a lifeline, a way to get from one place to another. For me, it became a nightmare. They say the city never sleeps. That may be true. But beneath the surface, something else stirs. Something that doesn't belong to the world above. There's a rhythm to New York City, one that I've known since I was a kid. I was born into the noise, raised in a cramped apartment in Queens with my mom, who worked 2 jobs, and my sister Callie, who always seemed to have a plan to escape. My dad left when I was 5, heading somewhere out west, and never came back. We didn't talk about him. Instead, we drowned the silence with TV shows, homework, and subway rides into Manhattan. The city molded me, made me its own. By the time I was 25, I had a steady job at a marketing firm near Wall Street, a decent apartment in Brooklyn, and a routine that fit neatly into the grid of city life. The morning subway ride was my meditation, ironically calming as the rumble of the train underfoot carried me through the veins of the city. Sure, the subway had its share of weirdos, but New York had taught me how to ignore them. You just keep moving. But last week, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was a typical Tuesday morning. I'd caught the train at 7:15, same as always. It was the 2 train, heading uptown. The car wasn't too packed yet, and I found a seat by the window. I plugged in my headphones, let some music fill the space between me and the world, and closed my eyes. For a while, I drifted in and out of thought, the constant hum of the tracks lulling me into that half-awake, half-asleep state where time ceases to matter. Suddenly, the train shuddered, jolting me out of my daze. The lights flickered, once, then twice, before settling into a dim, almost sepia tone. The train slowed down, not the smooth deceleration you expect when approaching a station, but a rough, unnatural jerk, like the wheels were grinding against something beneath the tracks. We weren't at a station. We had stopped in the middle of the tunnel, somewhere between 42nd Street and 50th. My heart picked up its pace. It wasn't the first time I'd been stuck in a subway tunnel. After all, it was New York. But something felt off this time. The announcement system crackled, but no one spoke. Just static. I looked around the car. People had started taking off their headphones, sharing confused glances. A man in a business suit stood up, tapping his foot impatiently, and a couple of teenagers near the door whispered to each other, looking around like they were waiting for something to happen. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Typical. I sighed and leaned back, deciding to wait it out. The subway system was old. Delays weren't unusual. But then I heard something. At first, I thought it was part of the train's mechanical groaning, but it wasn't. It was low, rhythmic, like something tapping, or maybe scratching, on metal. I took off my headphones, focusing on the sound. It came from under the car, or maybe from further down the tunnel. I couldn't be sure. Others heard it too. The man in the suit frowned, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to the door, pressing his ear against it. The tapping, or whatever it was, continued. Louder now, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get in. "Is it another train?" a woman asked from across the aisle, her voice shaky. "Maybe," someone muttered. "Maybe the track workers." But it didn't sound like that. The taps weren't mechanical. They had a human rhythm to them, uneven, unpredictable, almost intentional. I glanced at the teenagers by the door. One of them, short, dark-haired, shifted uncomfortably. He looked at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "You hear that?" I nodded, trying to shake off the rising tension. "It's probably nothing," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The scratching sound grew closer, and then, with no warning, the car went completely dark. The dim lights vanished, leaving us in pitch-black silence. For a few seconds, no one made a sound. Then came the murmurs, hushed and uneasy. I could feel the panic beginning to bubble in the air. The tapping resumed, this time from several points around us. Above. Below. I could hear it on the walls of the tunnel, like something was crawling just outside the windows, tracing the edges of our trapped car. The man in the suit yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. His breathing quickened as he cursed under his breath. "Shouldn't we?" The dark-haired teenager started, but his voice was drowned out by a sudden, deafening screech. It came from the front of the car, a metallic shriek that made the floor beneath my feet tremble. The sound was wrong. Too sharp. Too long. The train jolted again, but this time it wasn't the tracks. The movement felt deliberate, as if something was pulling at the front of the car. The screech continued, followed by the unmistakable sound of tearing metal. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. No one dared move. I could hear the faint breathing of the people around me, and beyond that, the slow, scraping sound of something approaching. Something alive. The panic hit me all at once. I needed to get out. I stumbled out of my seat, feeling my way toward the nearest door, my hands shaking. The screeching stopped, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. Then, just as suddenly as the lights had gone out, they flickered back on. But what they revealed wasn't relief. The man in the suit stood in front of the door, but his face was twisted in a grotesque expression of fear. His eyes were wide open, staring at something beyond the glass window of the door. Something stared back at him. The thing on the other side of the door, if it could be called a thing, was barely visible at first, its shape warped by the dim, flickering light. The man in the suit didn't move. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stood frozen, like a statue, locked in a silent, one-sided stare with whatever was out there. The rest of us were too stunned to speak. The air had gone cold, heavy with a sense of impending dread. For a moment, I convinced myself that maybe it was just a reflection, some kind of optical illusion caused by the old dirty glass. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. It was tall, taller than any human should be. Its body pressed unnaturally close to the door, as if its limbs had elongated and bent in unnatural ways to fit the narrow space. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a thin, skeletal frame. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze, sharp and probing, as though it was studying us, sizing us up like prey. The train car had gone silent. No one dared move. Even the man in the suit seemed locked in place, too terrified to take a step back. Then the thing moved. Just slightly. A twitch in the wrong direction, like it wasn't sure how to handle its own body. And that's when the smell hit. It rolled through the train car in waves, thick, rancid, like the stench of something long dead, something that had been rotting in the dark for far too long. The smell clung to the air, sinking deep into my lungs with every breath. I gagged, covering my nose, but it didn't help. Whatever was out there reeked of decay. The creature pressed closer to the door, and this time, I could hear the soft, wet sound of its hand, or what passed for a hand, sliding against the glass. My stomach churned as the realization hit me that the tapping sound we had been hearing wasn't some mechanical glitch or a fellow passenger. It was these things, these creatures. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The dark-haired teenager from before muttered something under his breath, backing away from the door. His friend followed, their eyes wide with fear. The woman across the aisle clutched her purse to her chest, her knuckles white, as if that small gesture could somehow protect her from the nightmare unfolding around us. I glanced at the man in the suit. He still hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on the creature outside. I couldn't understand how he was able to stand so still, so close to the thing. My instincts were screaming at me to get away, to run, but we were trapped. Trapped in this metal coffin, deep beneath the city. "Hey," I whispered, my voice barely finding the strength to break the silence. "Get back." He didn't respond. "Hey!" I tried again, louder this time. "Move away from the door." The thing outside twitched again, this time shifting its grotesque head toward me. For the first time, I saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was pulled tight over a skull-like structure, with deep, sunken eyes that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Its mouth, or the gash where a mouth should have been, stretched into an impossibly wide smile, filled with jagged, broken teeth. There was no humanity left in that face, only hunger. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. The man in the suit finally blinked, like he had been snapped out of a trance. His eyes darted to me, wide and bloodshot, filled with an emotion I didn't recognize at first. Desperation. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the only sound that came out was a sharp gasp. Then, without warning, the creature slammed its hand against the glass. The force of the impact rattled the entire door. A spider web of cracks spread across the glass, each line jagged and menacing. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, half growl, half wheeze, and struck the door again. This time, the cracks deepened. I bolted toward the center of the car, heart pounding. "We need to get out of here," I said, looking around at the other passengers. "Now!" But where could we go? We were stuck in the middle of a subway tunnel, far from the nearest station. The train car doors weren't moving, and the emergency exit was nowhere in sight. I glanced toward the far end of the car, where the connecting door led to the next train. Maybe, just maybe, we could force it open and make our way through the cars. The woman with the purse shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "What the hell is that thing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my own fear in check. "But it's trying to get in, and we don't want to be here when it does." The dark-haired teenager grabbed his friend's arm. "Let's go," he said, motioning toward the connecting door. "Come on, we can make it through the cars." The man in the suit finally snapped into action, stumbling back from the door as the creature continued its assault on the glass. The cracks were spreading faster now, the door barely holding. I wasn't sure how much longer it would last. We rushed toward the connecting door at the back of the car. I pushed on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. The creatures outside were relentless, and now we were trapped in here with no way out. "Shit," I muttered, yanking at the door handle again. It didn't move. It stuck. The sound of glass shattering cut through the air, and I turned just in time to see the door at the front of the car give way. The creature's arm shot through the broken window, long and thin, its fingers impossibly long, groping for something, or someone, inside the car. "Move!" I yelled, shoving the handle one last time. Finally, the door gave way, sliding open with a creak. I stumbled through, the others following close behind. But just as we made it into the next car, I heard the sound of metal scraping against metal. Something was coming, and it wasn't alone. As we slammed the door shut behind us, I caught a glimpse of more figures moving in the shadows of the tunnel, their twisted shapes barely visible through the grime-covered windows. My heart sank. There were more of them, and they were coming for us. We stood in the next car, panting, trying to process what had just happened. The door behind us rattled, shaking in its frame as the creatures outside clawed at it, eager to get through. I didn't have much time to think. I just knew we had to keep moving. The air in the new car felt different, stale, like it hadn't been breathed in for a long time. The dim, flickering lights barely illuminated the space, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. I glanced around. The seats were old, covered in grime and dust, as if no one had sat here in years. It didn't make sense. This was a regular subway route. People should have been using these cars daily. What the hell is happening? The dark-haired teenager, whose name I later learned was Chris, asked, his voice shaking. His friend, a taller guy with a shaved head named Malik, stood beside him, eyes wide with fear. Are those things people? I didn't have an answer. In the distance, through the window at the far end of the car, I could see more of the creatures, their distorted shapes slinking in and out of the tunnel's shadows. They weren't human anymore, that much was certain. Whatever they had been, they had changed into something else. We need to keep moving, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There's got to be a way out. The woman with the purse, Samantha, she said her name was, looked pale, her hands trembling. She clutched her bag like it was a lifeline, as if somehow it could protect her from what was happening. The man in the suit, who introduced himself as Jacob, was visibly shaking, his calm exterior from earlier completely shattered. I've lived in New York my whole life, Jacob muttered, mostly to himself. I've never seen anything like this. Not once. This can't be real. This isn't possible. I wanted to tell him it wasn't real either. But there was no denying what we'd all seen. Whatever those things were, they were real enough to shatter glass, to claw their way into the train car. And they were coming for us. I made my way toward the front of the car, hoping the connecting door would lead us closer to safety. As I reached it, I noticed something strange. The lights beyond this car were completely out. Just blackness. The further we went, the more it felt like we were descending into some deeper, forgotten part of the subway. The city above felt miles away now. Chris, Malik, Samantha, and Jacob followed behind me. I hesitated at the door, my hand resting on the handle, feeling the cold metal beneath my palm. I could hear the faint scraping sound again, that now familiar rhythm, like nails dragging along steel. My heartbeat quickened. "Let's go," Malik said, his voice barely concealing his panic. "We can't just stay here." I nodded and pulled the door open. The musty cold air rushed in, carrying with it the faint stench of decay. My stomach churned, but I stepped through, leading the group into the next car. The lights here barely worked, flickering sporadically, giving just enough light to make out vague shapes. It felt like stepping into an old, abandoned ghost train. The seats were overturned, some broken, and the floor was covered in debris, pieces of metal, old newspapers, and something else. Something dark and wet. I didn't want to think too much about what it was. The others hesitated, but we all pressed forward. Staying still wasn't an option. Whatever those things were, they were close behind us, and they were getting bolder. The car groaned under the weight of something moving on top of it, scurrying across the roof. A deep guttural hiss came from above, reverberating through the walls. Samantha gasped, clutching Jacob's arm for support. I tried to keep my focus ahead, on the connecting door to the next car. but my nerves were frayed. The sounds, the smells. It was all wrong. This wasn't just a broken down train or a routine delay. Something much worse was happening, and we were trapped in the middle of it. We were halfway through the car when the lights went out completely, plunging us into total darkness. Shit, Chris cursed under his breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping the flashlight would still work. But as I pulled it from my pocket, a sound echoed through the car. It was a low, clicking noise, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It came from the walls, from the floor, from every direction. Something was surrounding us, closing in. "What is that?" Malik whispered. Before I could answer, a sharp metallic bang rang out from the far end of the car. The door we had just come through rattled violently, and I knew the creatures were close, too close. The clicking grew louder, like the skittering of hundreds of legs moving in unison, and I realized with horror that the noise was coming from the walls themselves, like something was crawling inside the very structure of the car. Jacob was the first to panic, stumbling backward as the sounds closed in. "We're trapped, we're fucking trapped." "Calm down," I snapped, though my own fear was barely under control. "We need to keep moving." I turned to the door at the front of the car, but before I could reach it, the floor beneath my feet shifted. I staggered, catching myself against a seat, my heart racing as I looked down. The floor wasn't just debris and grime anymore. It was moving. I could barely make out the shapes at first. Small, pale things, wriggling and squirming through the cracks in the floorboards. They were thin, almost worm-like, with slick, translucent skin and too many legs. They scuttled across the ground in waves, spreading like a living carpet beneath us. "Jesus Christ," Samantha gasped, backing away. "What are those things?" "They're in the train," Chris said, his voice breaking. "They're coming from everywhere." I felt something brush against my ankle, and I kicked at it instinctively. But the things kept coming. They were fast, too fast, and they were filling the car now, spilling over the seats, climbing up the walls. Panic gripped me as I realized we couldn't stay here any longer. "Run," I shouted, shoving the door to the next car open. We barreled through, the sounds of the creatures, whatever they were, following close behind. The next car was just as dark, but I didn't stop to look. I led the group forward, our footsteps pounding against the floor, the creatures scurrying at our heels. My mind raced, desperately trying to figure out where we could go, what we could do. But there was no time to think. The only option was forward. As we reached the end of the car, I spotted something in the shadows, a faint glimmer of light, like a small opening in the wall. A door? An exit? But no. As we got closer, the light flickered, revealing something far worse. A hole, torn into the side of the train, gaping and jagged, leading down into the dark, where the creatures had come from. And now, they were waiting for us. I stood frozen, staring at the jagged hole in the side of the train car. It looked like it had been ripped open from the inside. Metal peeled back like a tin can, its sharp edges twisted and broken. The light that flickered through the gap was dim, barely illuminating the pitch-black tunnel beyond. But that wasn't what terrified me the most. It was the things waiting for us. The creatures stood just outside the hole, hunched and twitching in the shadows. They were like the one we had seen earlier, tall, pale, and grotesquely thin, their bodies warped and distorted in ways that defied human anatomy. Their skin gleamed slickly in the dim light, and their elongated arms ended in sharp, clawed fingers that scraped the ground as they moved. But what unsettled me the most were their eyes, those sunken, empty sockets that seemed to be staring right through me. I wasn't the only one who had seen them. Samantha, Jacob, Chris, and Malik all stood rooted to the spot, their faces pale, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time had stopped, suspended in the horrifying reality that we were no longer alone in the dark. Then, the creatures moved. They stepped closer, their twisted limbs contorting in unnatural ways as they crawled through the jagged hole and into the car. Their movements were fast, jerky, and disturbingly quiet, like insects scuttling along the walls of the tunnel. One of them let out a low, wheezing sound, the kind of noise that sent a chill down my spine. My body finally reacted, adrenaline kicking in. I shouted, grabbing Samantha by the arm and pulling her forward. Then we bolted, rushing down the length of the car, stumbling over overturned seats and debris. The creatures followed close behind, their long skeletal fingers scraping against the metal walls, leaving deep gashes in their wake. I could hear them, too many of them, scuttling along the roof, the floor, the walls, their claws making that awful clicking sound. The others were right behind me, but I could feel the panic rising in all of us. Samantha's breaths came in ragged gasps, and Jacob's eyes were wide with terror, darting around as if he couldn't believe what was happening. Chris and Malik were ahead of us, their footsteps pounding against the ground as they scrambled to reach the next car. I reached the connecting door, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grasp the handle. Behind me, the creatures were getting closer. I could hear the soft hiss of their breath, the wet sound of their feet on the floor. I pulled the door open just as one of them lunged at us, its arm shooting out and missing Jacob by inches. The door slid shut with a bang, and we stumbled into the next car, gasping for air. But there was no time to rest. The creatures were relentless. I could see them through the grime-covered windows, their twisted forms pressing against the glass, their hands clawing at the edges of the door. They weren't giving up. They were hunting us. What are they? Samantha panted, her voice trembling. I don't know, I replied, shaking my head. But they're not stopping. We have to keep moving. The new car was just as dark and decrepit as the last. The lights flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows across the walls. I didn't want to think about how long this train had been in operation, how many years it had been running these tunnels. Something about it felt wrong, like we had crossed over into a part of the subway that wasn't meant to be seen, a part of the city that had been forgotten or abandoned. We kept moving, faster now, our breaths ragged and panicked. Chris led the way, followed by Malik, with Samantha and Jacob close behind me. I could still hear the creatures scratching at the door behind us, their claws making that horrible, grating sound. Every time I looked back, I half expected to see them breaking through, their twisted forms crawling toward us like nightmares brought to life. The next connecting door loomed ahead, and I rushed toward it, hoping, praying that it would lead us closer to safety. But as I reached for the handle, the ground beneath me trembled. The entire train car shuddered, metal groaning under the weight of something massive. What the hell was that? Chris asked, looking around nervously. Before I could respond, the floor beneath us gave a violent lurch. I stumbled, falling against the seats as the train shook. It wasn't just the usual rattling of an old subway car. This was different, more like an earthquake, or something far more deliberate. The lights flickered wildly, plunging us into momentary darkness before stuttering back to life. Samantha let out a scream, and I turned to see what had caused it. One of the creatures had broken through the door at the back of the car. It stood in the entrance, its gaunt, skeletal form towering over us. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyeless face scanning the room. Behind it, more of them poured in, crawling through the broken doorway and into the car. "We need to go now," Jacob yelled, grabbing Chris by the arm. But it was too late. The floor beneath us gave another lurch, this time more violent, and before I could react, the entire train car tipped. It felt like the world had turned sideways. I was thrown off my feet, crashing into the side of the car as gravity shifted. Seats, debris, and bodies were flung across the space as the train groaned, metal screeching against metal. We were falling, descending into some deeper, darker part of the tunnel. My body slammed against the wall, pain shooting through my ribs as I tried to grab onto something, anything to stop my fall. The others were tumbling around me, their screams echoing in the enclosed space. I reached for a handrail, barely managing to grab it as the train continued its descent. The creatures were still there, crawling along the walls, their twisted limbs unaffected by the chaos. We were heading somewhere, down. The train slammed to a stop, sending a violent jolt through the car. I was thrown forward, my grip on the handrail slipping as I crashed into the opposite wall. Pain exploded in my shoulder, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Everything was spinning, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. When I finally managed to push myself up, I looked around. The others were sprawled across the floor, groaning in pain. Chris was clutching his arm, his face pale, while Samantha lay motionless, her purse still clutched in her hands. I crawled over to her, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open, and she let out a weak gasp. "What happened?" she whispered. "We fell," I muttered, glancing around the car. The train had stopped, but it wasn't over. I could still hear them, the creatures. They were close. Too close. I helped Samantha to her feet, my heart racing. There was no time to think, no time to rest. We needed to move. We needed to get out of here. But as I looked out the broken windows, something else caught my attention. The tunnel outside wasn't like the subway tunnels I knew. It was older, more primitive. The walls were rough, carved from stone, and the air smelled different. Damp, stale, like the breath of something ancient. And there, in the distance, I saw it. A cavern. Massive and yawning, disappearing into the depths of the earth. We weren't in the subway anymore. We were somewhere else. Somewhere we weren't supposed to be. The train had come to a violent stop, the car wedged precariously against the edge of a gaping underground cavern. My body ached from the fall, but that pain was nothing compared to the cold dread that swept over me as I took in our new surroundings. The tunnel we had been traveling through was gone, collapsed behind us, and we were now in a place far more alien and terrifying than any New York subway I had ever known. The cavern stretched out before us, vast and oppressive. The walls were jagged, dripping with moisture, and the air was thick with a foul, damp odor. It felt ancient, untouched by human hands for centuries, as if it had been hidden beneath the city for an eternity. The faint light that flickered from the destroyed train barely reached the far corners, casting strange, shifting shadows over the stone. I could hear the others groaning as they slowly got to their feet. Chris and Malik were huddled together, while Samantha clutched her purse with white-knuckled hands. Jacob leaned against the wreckage of the train, his face pale and sweaty, muttering something under his breath. We were all shaken, terrified, and confused. But the worst part? The creatures, the ones I now knew had been hunting us, had followed us. They were still out there, hiding in the shadows, their guttural breaths and clicking claws echoing through the wreckage. I could feel their presence, stalking us, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We have to move," I said, my voice strained. "We can't stay here." Malik looked around, his eyes wide with fear. "Move where? There's no way out. We're underground. Who knows how deep?" Samantha nodded, her voice trembling. "What are those things? They aren't human. They can't be." I shook my head. They were. Once. Everyone turned to look at me, confusion on their faces. But I knew. I had heard about them before. Stories whispered in the dark corners of New York, rumors that most people dismissed as urban legends. The Mole People, homeless communities that supposedly lived beneath the city in forgotten subway tunnels, places no one went anymore. The first time I heard about the Mole People was when I was a kid, growing up in Queens. A friend of mine, Tony, used to tell me about his uncle, who worked for the MTA. He claimed his uncle had once seen them, pale, emaciated figures lurking in the depths of the subway tunnels. Back then, I'd laughed it off as a silly story. But now, seeing these creatures, I realized it wasn't just a myth. People used to call them the Mole People, I said, my voice hollow. But these things, they're not human anymore. Samantha blinked at me, clutching her purse tighter. "What do you mean? They were people?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, people who lived underground for so long that something happened to them. The darkness changed them." I didn't know exactly how or why. Maybe it was the isolation, the lack of sunlight, or something far worse. But the result was in front of us. Mutated, twisted creatures with pale, translucent skin, eyes that no longer saw the light, and bodies that had adapted to the darkness in grotesque ways. Chris shuddered. "Jesus." "We can't let them catch us," I said, my voice firm. "We have to keep moving, find a way out of here." Jacob let out a shaky breath. "But where? This place doesn't look like any part of the subway. It's older." He wasn't wrong. The walls of the cavern were rough, primitive, like they had been carved out by some ancient force. It didn't feel like we were beneath New York anymore. It felt like we had stumbled into something much older and much more dangerous. I stepped toward the edge of the cavern, peering into the darkness. There was no telling how far it stretched or what lay at the bottom, but staying in the wrecked train wasn't an option. The Mole People were already closing in on us. I could hear their clicking claws getting closer, their raspy breaths echoing through the twisted remains of the car. "We go deeper," I said, pointing toward the far side of the cavern where the ground seemed to slope downward. "It's the only way." Malik frowned. "You want us to go down? Into the dark?" "You got a better idea?" I shot back. "We're trapped up here, and those things are coming for us. If we stay, we die." Chris glanced nervously toward the wrecked train, his eyes wide. "He's right. We don't have a choice." With a heavy sigh, Malik nodded, and we began making our way down the uneven slope. The stone beneath our feet was slick with moisture, and every step felt more precarious than the last. Samantha stumbled, and I reached out to steady her, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind us, I could still hear the soft clicking, the sound of claws scraping against stone. "They're following us," Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," I replied, keeping my eyes forward. "Just keep moving." As we descended, the air grew colder and more oppressive. The smell of decay grew stronger, and I could feel it clinging to my skin, thick and heavy. It wasn't just the smell of rot. It was the smell of death, ancient and pervasive, like the very ground we were walking on had seen countless lives lost over centuries. Suddenly, Chris stopped in his tracks. "Wait, do you see that?" I followed his gaze and squinted into the darkness. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, but then I saw it. A faint, sickly yellow light, flickering weakly in the distance. "An exit?" Malik asked, his voice hopeful for the first time. I don't know, I said, my stomach churning with unease. But it's our only lead. We moved cautiously toward the light, our steps slow and deliberate. The ground beneath us was uneven, littered with debris, old crates, rusted metal, and pieces of broken machinery. As we got closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating a small area ahead. When we reached it, I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't an exit. It was a camp, a crude, makeshift camp that looked like it had been abandoned years ago. Rusted barrels filled with glowing liquid dotted the area, casting an eerie glow over the ground. Pieces of torn fabric and old tools were strewn about, as if whoever had been living here had left in a hurry, or been dragged away. "What the hell is this?" Chris muttered, stepping closer to one of the barrels. I crouched down next to the closest barrel, peering inside. The liquid was thick, glowing with a sickly yellow hue, and there were strange, dark shapes floating within. I couldn't tell what they were. Flesh, maybe. Bone. My skin crawled and I quickly stood up. I don't know, but we shouldn't stay here. Samantha was shaking, her eyes wide with fear. Who would live down here? Jacob's voice trembled as he spoke. Maybe the mole people used to live here. Before they turned into those things. The thought made my blood run cold. If this was where they had lived, then whatever had happened to them had happened here. And now we were standing in the middle of it. "We need to go," I said, my voice urgent. "They're close. A loud metallic clang echoed through the cavern, and I whipped around to see one of the creatures emerging from the shadows. It lunged at Chris, its long clawed fingers catching his leg and pulling him to the ground. Chris screamed, his hands clawing at the dirt as the creature dragged him backward. "Help!" he cried, his voice desperate. Without thinking, I grabbed a rusted pipe from the ground and swung it at the creature. The metal connected with a sickening crack, and the creature let out a screech, releasing Chris. But the others were already closing in. Their twisted forms emerged from the darkness, surrounding us on all sides. We were trapped. The creatures were closing in, their twisted, inhuman forms crawling from the shadows, their eyeless faces fixed on us like predators hunting cornered prey. Panic surged through me, making my breath come in shallow gasps. I gripped the rusted metal pipe tightly in my hand, though deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. These things, they weren't just dangerous. They were inevitable. They were death-given form, and they were about to tear us apart. Chris scrambled to his feet, clutching the bleeding gash in his leg where the creature had grabbed him. "We need to get out of here," he yelled, his voice frantic. "We need to—" Before he could finish, one of the creatures lunged at him again, its long, skeletal arms wrapped around his chest, pulling him back into the darkness. Chris screamed, flailing wildly, but it was no use. I could hear the wet, sickening sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing. The creature's claws dug deep into him, pulling him apart like he was nothing more than a fragile toy. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, glistening in the sickly yellow light of the barrels. His scream was cut short by a sharp gurgling noise as the creature tore open his throat, its jagged teeth ripping through his skin. In moments, there was nothing left but a mangled corpse. Malik let out a horrified scream and staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh my God, Chris." There was no time to mourn. The creatures moved in on us, their movements quick and unnatural, like spiders skittering across the ground. Malik barely had time to react before another one of the creatures was upon him. It leaped from the shadows, its long, talon-like fingers slicing through the air. Samantha screamed to get his attention, but it was too late. The creature struck with terrifying precision, driving its claws into Malik's abdomen. His body convulsed violently, and a sharp gasp escaped his lips. Blood poured from the deep wounds, splattering the stone floor. Malik's eyes bulged in shock as he looked down at the gaping holes in his stomach, his hands feebly trying to push the creature away. The thing didn't hesitate. It ripped its claws out of Malik's torso, taking a chunk of his flesh with it. Malik collapsed to the ground, his body twitching, his blood pooling around him in a thick, dark stain. The creature stood over him, its head tilted as it watched the life drain from his body, like a curious predator studying its kill. Samantha sobbed, backing away as the horror unfolded in front of her. "No. Please, no." Jacob, pale and drenched in sweat, stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. "We're going to die," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We're all going to die." I grabbed his arm, shaking him violently. "Not if we keep moving. We have to get out of here." But there was no time. The creatures were relentless, crawling over the stone floor, their claws clicking against the ground. Samantha tried to run, but she didn't make it far. One of the creatures appeared from the side, its pale, slimy body sliding out of the darkness like a nightmare come to life. With a quick, fluid motion, it lashed out, wrapping its long, bony arm around Samantha's neck. Her scream was cut off as it lifted her off the ground, her legs kicking wildly in the air. I watched, helpless, as the creature's claws tightened around her throat. There was a sickening crunch as her neck snapped, her head lolling to the side like a broken doll. The creature tossed her limp body to the ground, her lifeless eyes staring up at me, wide with terror. Jacob let out a guttural sob, his body trembling violently. No. This can't be happening. I could feel the hot bile rising in my throat. Everyone was dying around me. I had seen horror before. This was New York, after all. I'd witnessed violence, been to funerals, heard gunshots in the distance. But this was something else. This was primal, vicious, like we were animals being hunted. Jacob turned to run, his feet slipping on the blood-soaked ground, but before he could make it 2 steps, one of the creatures was on him. Its long, spindly fingers wrapped around his arms, and it lifted him effortlessly off the ground, its teeth bared in a grotesque, broken smile. "Help me," Jacob screamed, his voice cracking in pure terror. "Please, God, help me." I stepped forward instinctively, wanting to do something, anything to save him, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear had rooted me to the spot. I watched in horror as the creature ripped into Jacob's body, tearing him apart with brutal efficiency. Blood sprayed in every direction, and his screams faded into a wet, gurgling noise as the creature pulled his insides out, stringing them across the ground like some grotesque display. Then, silence. I stood there, covered in the blood of my friends, trembling uncontrollably. The creatures hadn't come for me yet. I didn't know why, and I didn't care. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of there before I ended up like the others. I turned and bolted, my feet slipping on the slick stone floor as I ran deeper into the cavern. My heart pounded in my chest, my breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. Behind me, I could still hear the creatures, but they didn't seem to be following as closely anymore. Maybe they'd had their fill. Maybe they didn't need me. But I wasn't going to wait around to find out. The cavern stretched on and on, a seemingly endless maze of stone and darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if there was even a way out. But I kept running, my mind filled with nothing but the desperate need to survive. I rounded a corner and nearly skidded to a stop when I saw it. A narrow, jagged opening in the wall ahead, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. Beyond it, I could see faint light. It wasn't the sickly yellow of the barrels we had seen earlier. It was softer, more natural. An exit. With the creatures still lurking behind me, I didn't hesitate. I squeezed through the opening, the sharp edges of the stone cutting into my skin, and emerged on the other side into a narrow, rocky tunnel. The air was different here, fresher, cleaner. I could feel it filling my lungs, and for the first time since the train crash, I felt a flicker of hope. But then I heard it. The sound of something large, something far bigger than the creatures, moving in the darkness behind me. The ground trembled beneath my feet as the noise grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running. I didn't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. The tunnel stretched on, twisting and turning, but always leading upward. The light ahead of me grew brighter, and I could feel the cool, fresh air of the surface against my skin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled out of the tunnel and into the open air. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the sunlight warm on my face. I had made it. I was alive. But I was alone. Everyone else was gone. And as I lay there, staring up at the clear blue sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped at all. Because somewhere, deep beneath the streets of New York, the mole people were still there.